How does a quiet bookworm become a fearless prophet? What kind of love is so threatening to the powerful that they resort to assassination? And why did Romero's voice for the voiceless echo around the world as the sound of the gospel lived without compromise? This is the story of Saint Oscar Romero, the bishop who proved that authentic Christianity must take sides. The side of justice, truth, and the poor. If you've ever wondered whether faith should engage with politics, let this story show you what happens when the gospel meets the real world. What would it take for you to risk everything for truth? Saint Oscar Romero's story shows us. Stay with us as we journey from his quiet beginnings to his fearless stand against oppression. Hit like and subscribe for more stories of faith that challenge, inspire, and confront the powers of our time. On the 15th of August 1917, in the small mountain town of Ciudad Barrios, El Salvador, a boy was born who would one day shake the foundations of both church and state through the sheer power of gospel truth. Oscar Arnulfo Romero y Galdames entered a world of profound inequality, where a handful of wealthy families controlled vast coffee plantations, while the majority of the population lived in crushing poverty. Oscar's family occupied the precarious middle ground of small-town El Salvador. His father, Santos, was a telegraph operator and part-time postmaster, respectable work that provided modest comfort but no security. His mother, Guadalupe, managed their small household with the skill of someone who understood that every peso mattered. From his earliest years, Oscar showed little interest in the rough games and loud adventures that captivated other boys. Instead, he was drawn to books, quiet reflection, and the rhythms of religious life that marked his deeply Catholic community. While his brothers played soccer in the dusty streets, Oscar could be found reading in the shade of their small house or helping his mother with household chores. He was always different. His mother later recalled, even as a child, he seemed to carry the sorrows of others in his heart. At age 13, Oscar left home to study for the priesthood at the minor seminary in San Miguel. The decision surprised no one. The quiet, studious boy seemed naturally suited for religious life, but it broke his father's heart, who had hoped his son might take over the family's small carpentry business. Seminary life suited Oscar perfectly. He excelled in his studies, particularly in theology and philosophy, showing a brilliant analytical mind that impressed his professors. But more than intellectual achievement, Oscar was developing a deep interior life centered on prayer, meditation, and careful study of Scripture. His fellow seminarians remember him as kind but distant, pious but not sanctimonious, intelligent but humble about his gifts. He seemed destined for a quiet life of pastoral ministry in some small parish, serving the faithful with gentle dedication and scholarly competence. After completing his studies in El Salvador, Oscar was sent to Rome to finish his theological education at the Gregorian University. The experience of living in the Eternal City, surrounded by the art and architecture of centuries of Catholic tradition, deepened his love for the institutional church and its ancient wisdom. On the 4th of April 1942, Oscar was ordained a priest in Rome. He celebrated his first Mass in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by the tombs of popes and martyrs, never imagining that he himself would one day join their ranks. Returning to El Salvador, Father Romero was assigned to parish work in the countryside, where he first encountered the grinding poverty that marked the lives of most Salvadorans. But the shy young priest seemed more comfortable with his books and prayer than with the messy realities of social injustice. For the next 20 years, Oscar Romero lived a life of quiet priestly service that gave no hint of the revolutionary he would become. Father Romero's reputation as a scholar and administrator grew steadily throughout the year 1940s and 1950s. His superiors recognized his intelligence, his dedication, and his unquestioning loyalty to church authority. In a region where some priests were beginning to question traditional approaches to ministry, Romero represented stability and orthodoxy. In 1967, he was appointed secretary of the Salvadoran Bishops' Conference, a position that brought him into contact with the highest levels of church leadership and government. Romero proved to be an efficient administrator who could navigate the complex relationships between church and state with diplomatic skill. His conservative approach to ministry put him at odds with the growing liberation theology movement that was sweeping through Latin American Catholicism. While younger priests talked about preferential option for the poor and social sin, Romero emphasized traditional spirituality, personal conversion, and the Church's role as a guardian of eternal rather than temporal concerns. The Church's mission is to save souls, he would say, not to solve political problems. In 1970, Romero was appointed auxiliary bishop of San Salvador, and 4 years later he became bishop of Santiago de Maria, a rural diocese in the heart of El Salvador's coffee-growing region. The appointment seemed perfect for the scholarly, non-political prelate who preferred libraries to demonstrations and prayer to protests. But Santiago de Maria would change everything. For the first time in his career, Bishop Romero was forced to confront the brutal realities of life for El Salvador's poor majority. His diocese included some of the country's largest coffee plantations, where peasant workers lived in conditions that hadn't changed substantially since colonial times. During coffee harvest season, entire families would work from dawn to dusk, picking beans for wages that barely covered their most basic needs. Children as young as 6 worked alongside their parents, their small hands bleeding from the thorny coffee plants. Housing consisted of one-room shacks without electricity, running water, or adequate sanitation. When workers attempted to organize for better conditions, they faced intimidation, violence, and death from private security forces that operated with complete impunity. The government and wealthy landowners considered any call for workers' rights to be communist subversion deserving of brutal suppression. Initially, Bishop Romero tried to address these problems through traditional church channels: charity for the poor, moral exhortation for the rich, and patient dialogue with authorities. But he gradually began to understand that individual charity could not address systemic injustice, that good intentions could not overcome structural violence. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Romero started speaking more directly about economic inequality in his homilies. He began visiting the poor in their homes rather than waiting for them to come to church. He listened to their stories of suffering and began to see connections between their poverty and the policies of government and business. But the real conversion was still to come, triggered by an event that would shatter Romero's comfortable assumptions about church, society, and the gospel's demands. The event that transformed Oscar Romero from conservative bishop to prophetic voice came on the 12th of March 1977, just 3 weeks after he had been appointed Archbishop of San Salvador. Father Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit priest who had become Romero's close friend, was assassinated along with 2 companions while driving to celebrate Mass in the small town of El Paisnal. Father Grande had been working with peasant communities, helping them organize cooperatives, teaching them to read, and encouraging them to see their dignity as children of God. His work had angered wealthy landowners and government officials who saw any effort to empower the poor as a threat to their privileges. The assassination was brutal and deliberate, machine gun fire that left no doubt about the intended message. Priests who worked for social justice would be killed, and the church had better return to its traditional role of blessing the status quo rather than challenging it. For Romero, Grande's death was both personal devastation and spiritual earthquake. Here was a gentle, scholarly priest, much like himself, who had been murdered simply for preaching the gospel's message of justice and human dignity. The killing forced Romero to confront fundamental questions about the church's role in society and his own responsibilities as a bishop. "When I looked at Rutilio's body," Romero later said, "I saw the body of Christ crucified again in our people." The funeral mass for Father Grande became Romero's first public declaration that the church could not remain neutral in the face of systematic oppression. Instead of the quiet diplomatic service that many expected, Romero delivered a homily that shocked both government officials and wealthy Catholics. "The church cannot remain silent before the murder of its priests," he declared. "We demand justice for Father Grande and for all the poor who suffer violence in this country." But Romero went further than words. he announced that he would not attend any government functions until Father Grande's killers were brought to justice. A boycott that would last for the remaining 3 years of his life. He also made a decision that scandalized El Salvador's wealthy elite. Instead of celebrating separate masses in the capital's various parishes, there would be only one mass the following Sunday, and it would be held in the cathedral for all of San Salvador's Catholics together. The symbolism was unmistakable. In a country rigidly divided by class and race, where the wealthy worshipped in exclusive parishes while the poor crowded into humble churches, Romero was declaring that God's house belonged equally to all God's children. The cathedral was packed beyond capacity that Sunday, with thousands of people spilling into the streets outside. Rich and poor, government officials and peasant farmers, military officers and union leaders all heard the same message. The church would no longer bless injustice or remain silent in the face of oppression. The church's mission, Romero announced, is to be the voice of those who have no voice. The transformation was complete, but the real struggle was just beginning. Once Romero had chosen to speak for the poor and oppressed, there was no turning back. His weekly homilies, broadcast throughout El Salvador and much of Central America, became the most listened-to program in the region's history. In a country where independent media was virtually non-existent, Archbishop Romero's Sunday sermons became the people's news service, their source of truth in a sea of government propaganda. Each week, Romero would meticulously document the violence that had occurred in El Salvador. The peasants murdered for joining cooperatives, the students killed for protesting, the workers disappeared for organizing unions. He would read their names from the pulpit, ensuring that their deaths would not be forgotten or ignored. "We must unmask the lies and speak the truth," he declared. "The poor cannot be silenced because God hears their cry." His homilies were theological masterpieces that connected ancient biblical texts to contemporary Salvadoran realities. When he preached about Jesus driving the money changers from the temple, his listeners understood he was talking about their own corrupt political and economic systems. When he spoke of God's preferential love for the poor, wealthy Catholics squirmed uncomfortably in their pews. But Romero's message was not one of hatred or class warfare. Even as he denounced injustice, he called for conversion of heart rather than violent revolution. He pleaded with the wealthy to share their abundance voluntarily rather than wait for it to be taken by force. He urged the poor to respond to oppression with dignity rather than vengeance. "I do not believe in death or violence," he said. "I believe in resurrection, in life, in the triumph of justice through love." The government's response was swift and brutal. Romero was denounced as a communist sympathizer, a threat to national security, and a traitor to his own country. Wealthy Catholics began boycotting his masses and cutting off financial support to the archdiocese. Conservative bishops criticized him for politicizing the gospel and abandoning the church's traditional neutrality. Death threats became a daily reality. Bomb threats forced the evacuation of the cathedral during services. Armed guards were stationed outside Romero's residence, and his friends begged him to accept bodyguards or leave the country for his own safety. But Romero refused to be silenced or intimidated. "The shepherd cannot run when the wolves attack the flock," he said. "My place is with my people, whatever the cost." International attention began to focus on the small Central American country, where a Catholic archbishop had become the leading voice of opposition to government oppression. Romero's writings were translated into multiple languages, and he received honorary doctorates from universities around the world. How do you speak truth to power when power has all the weapons? By 1980, El Salvador was sliding toward full-scale civil war. Government death squads were murdering suspected dissidents with impunity, while leftist guerrilla groups responded with their own acts of violence. The country was trapped in a spiral of terror that threatened to consume everyone. In this atmosphere of escalating violence, Archbishop Romero emerged as perhaps the only moral authority that both sides still respected. His consistent message of nonviolence and human rights offered an alternative to the extremes of brutal repression and armed revolution. But Romero's influence made him increasingly dangerous to those who profited from El Salvador's unjust system. His weekly radio homilies reached hundreds of thousands of people throughout Central America, spreading ideas about human dignity and social justice that threatened the entire regional power structure. The final crisis came in March 1980, when Romero wrote an open letter to U.S. President Jimmy Carter, pleading with him to stop military aid to El Salvador's government. In the letter, which was published internationally, Romero documented systematic human rights violations by the Salvadoran military and argued that American weapons were being used to kill innocent civilians. "Your government's contribution," he wrote, "instead of favoring greater justice and peace in El Salvador, will undoubtedly sharpen the injustice and the repression inflicted on the organized people, whose struggle has often been for respect for their most basic human rights." The letter enraged both the Salvadoran government and powerful interests in the United States, who supported military intervention in Central America. Romero had crossed a line from domestic critic to international opponent of U.S. foreign policy. On the 23rd of March 1980, Romero delivered what would prove to be his final Sunday homily. Speaking to a packed cathedral and a radio audience that stretched across the Americas, he made a direct appeal to the soldiers and police who were carrying out the violence against their own people. "I would like to make a special appeal to the men of the army," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for God himself. "Brothers, you come from our own people. You are killing your own brother peasants, when any human order to kill must be subordinate to the law of God, which says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God." It was an unprecedented challenge to military authority, a direct call for soldiers to disobey orders that violated their conscience and their faith. In the context of El Salvador's authoritarian system, it was tantamount to a call for revolution. "In the name of God," Romero concluded, "in the name of this suffering people whose cries rise to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression." The words hung in the air like thunder, reverberating through the cathedral and across the radio waves to reach every corner of the country. Everyone understood that Archbishop Romero had just signed his own death warrant. The powers that ruled El Salvador could not allow such defiance to stand. On the 24th of March 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero was celebrating Mass at the chapel of the Divine Providence Cancer Hospital where he lived. It was a small, quiet service, a stark contrast to the massive crowds that usually gathered for his Sunday homilies at the cathedral. As Romero stood at the altar during the consecration, speaking the words that Catholics believe transform bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, a single shot rang out. The bullet struck him in the chest, and he collapsed behind the altar where he had been offering the Eucharist. The assassination was swift, professional, and symbolic. The man who had spoken for the voiceless had been silenced at the very moment when he was celebrating the ultimate act of love, Christ's sacrifice for humanity. Romero died as he had lived in his final years, offering himself for his people, standing at the intersection of divine love and human suffering, proclaiming with his life that the gospel demands concrete action for justice and peace. The immediate response to his assassination revealed the depth of his impact on Salvadoran society. Over 100,000 people gathered for his funeral mass, the largest crowd in the country's history. They came from every corner of El Salvador. Peasants and intellectuals, students and workers, the poor he had championed and the wealthy he had challenged. But even the funeral became a scene of violence when government forces opened fire on the mourners, killing dozens more and confirming everything Romero had said about the brutality of the regime he had opposed. The assassination backfired spectacularly for those who ordered it. Instead of silencing Romero's message, his martyrdom amplified it around the world. His death became a symbol of the Church's commitment to social justice and human rights, inspiring liberation movements throughout Latin America and beyond. More importantly, his life and death demonstrated that the gospel is not neutral in the face of oppression. Romero had shown that authentic Christianity must take sides, not the side of any political party or ideology, but the side of truth, justice, and human dignity. The shy scholar, who had once avoided politics, had become the most political figure in El Salvador's history, not by embracing partisan politics, but by living the gospel so radically that it threatened every unjust structure in his society. In the decades following his assassination, Oscar Romero's influence continued to grow far beyond the borders of El Salvador. His writings were translated into dozens of languages, his homilies were studied in universities around the world, and his example inspired countless Christians to see social justice as an essential component of authentic faith. The process of recognizing Romero's sanctity was long and controversial. Conservative forces within the Catholic Church argued that his involvement in politics disqualified him from sainthood, while supporters insisted that his commitment to the poor was precisely what made him holy. The breakthrough came with the election of Pope Francis, the first Latin American pope, who understood from personal experience the realities that had shaped Romero's ministry. On the 23rd of May 2015, Pope Francis beatified Romero, and on the 14th of October 2018, he canonized him as Saint Oscar Romero. In his canonization homily, Pope Francis declared, "Saint Romero reminds us that the Church's credibility passes through the royal road of love, especially love for the poor, the marginalized, those whom society discards." Today, Saint Oscar Romero is venerated throughout the Americas as a patron of social justice and human rights. His feast day, March 24, is observed not only by Catholics, but by people of all faiths who recognize in his witness a powerful example of moral courage and prophetic leadership. Universities and human rights organizations around the world have been named in his honor. His image appears on murals throughout Latin America, often depicting him not in traditional episcopal robes, but among the poor he served, or with the radio microphone through which he spoke truth to power. But perhaps Romero's greatest legacy is the challenge he poses to every generation of Christians. Will the Church be a comfortable chaplain to the status quo, or will it be a prophetic voice for transformation? Will faith be a private comfort that doesn't disturb earthly arrangements, or will it be a public witness that demands justice for all God's children? Saint Oscar Romero reminds us that neutrality in the face of oppression is impossible for those who follow the God who lifts up the lowly and brings down the mighty. His witness echoes across the decades. The gospel is not a spiritual tranquilizer, but a call to radical love that transforms both hearts and societies. The Archbishop who died preaching against oppression continues to preach from beyond the grave, his voice joining the eternal choir of martyrs who remind us that some truths are worth dying for, and that love lived authentically will always threaten those who profit from hatred. Oscar Romero discovered that the Church's credibility depends not on its power, but on its willingness to sacrifice for love. His legacy invites us to follow the same costly path of prophetic discipleship,